Hello, my name is Christopher Lamont, and I'm an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Groningen, and I'm also here in Osaka on a cross appointment at the Osaka School of International Public Policy, and today I'll be talking to you about the impact of the Libyan conflict on Tunisia.
Hello, I'm Meitek Boduszynski, and I'm an assistant professor of politics and international relations at Tomona College in the United States. I'm here visiting Osaka University and discussing with Chris the Libyan conflict and its implications for the region. So Chris, I thought we could talk a bit today about Libya and Tunisia. Libya being close to my heart, Tunisia being closer to yours, two countries that represent sort of opposite ends of the spectrum of the Arab Spring. One very successful case, Tunisia, which has had another round of successful elections, has consolidated democratic institutions. It looks like it's on a very positive road. In Libya, which doesn't make as much news as Syria and Iraq and Islamic State, which we hear about all the time, and yet is in a very bad state, split between two rival governments and lots of extra state militias running around, jihadis camped out in the east, many problems indeed. Really on the road to becoming a failed state. And of course the problems that we've seen in Libya haven't been confined to Libya. They've affected the entire region. Really from the beginning of the revolution, we've seen a large number of arms that were captured by militias from the former Gaddafi government in Libya, finding themselves throughout the region from Mali all the way to Sinai and maybe even beyond, maybe even Syria and other places. I'm curious though, what kind of effect has this instability in Libya had on Tunisia?
Yeah, on the one hand, I mean, as you mentioned, the conflict in Libya has been impacting Tunisia ever since the revolution and the start of the Libyan civil war. And one of the things that Tunisia has been confronted with is absorbing large numbers of Libyan refugees and Libyans who have been fleeing the conflict. And this is something that Tunisia had been coping with since 2011 and has been coping with again more recently following the outbreak of this more recent conflict in Libya. And in terms of population, Tunisia is a relatively small country of about 10 million people. And some of the estimates of the numbers of Libyan refugees in Tunisia have been astronomical. So it's on the one hand quite impressive that a country like Tunisia has been able to absorb such a large influx of people from Libya. And that's definitely one of the impacts that's most visible in Tunisia. In fact, this past summer, for example, you would see almost more Libyan licensed vehicles on the roads than any other kind of foreign country in Tunisia.
What kind of controls does the Tunisian government have in terms of the Libyans that they're letting in? Do Libyans wanting to cross into Tunisia have to show that they have a certain amount of financial resources? Are there extensive background checks on these Libyans? What are the immigration controls like?
I mean, at the border crossings themselves, so at the official crossings, you do have Libyans being allowed in who are predominantly affluent, right, who have the means to support themselves within Tunisia. The concern about people who've been crossing the border kind of at the official checkpoints has been more about third country nationals fleeing the Libyan conflict and trying to enter Tunisia, in particular Egyptians, for example. So there are a large number of Egyptian workers in Libya, as we know, and a lot of them tried to leave this past summer for Tunisia. And at one point, the Tunisian government closed the border to Egyptian nationals.
Interesting. And why did they go to Tunisia and not back to Egypt?
My assumption is because it's they were probably working in the Tripoli area,
I see.
Right? And so it was too dangerous to make the trek across the east of Libya back to Egypt. So there was an arrangement made that allowed these people to cross and be flown back quickly to Egypt in the end. But this is something that has caused a significant amount of stress on Tunisia's transition, in a way, not necessarily because of the numbers of Libyans themselves, but because of public perceptions of large numbers of Libyans being in Tunisia. In fact, that sometimes there's a tendency, or there was a tendency on the part of the media to highlight crimes, for example, that were committed by Libyans and play on negative stereotypes of Libyans in Tunisia.
And one thing we know about Libya is that in this current state of chaos and given all the ungoverned spaces in Libya, it's well known that there are militias and individuals who are extremists, some of whom have gone to fight in Syria with the Islamic State, and some of whom have carried out attacks within Libya, prominently the attack on the U.S. mission in Benghazi in 2012 that killed the U.S. ambassador. Is Tunisia concerned, like Egypt is, for instance, about flows of extremists?
Yeah, this is something that has been of great concern to Tunisia's transitional governments. So both looking at the Troika government and looking at the new government, which has is just forming now in the aftermath of Tunisia's most recent elections. On the one hand, Tunisia has absorbed large numbers of Libyans. In a sense, one reason why it was able to do so perhaps was because a lot of the Libyans, as we discussed earlier, who crossed were people who could financially support themselves in Tunisia. So they were staying in hotels or they were renting houses, and many of them were professionals or young professionals. But the more pernicious knock-on effect of the Libyan conflict comes from what you're talking about here, and that's the flow of weapons across the border. And as we know, Tunisia has experienced quite a bit of turbulence in relation to its transition that stems from instability in the hinterland, so around the Mount Chambi area where the Tunisian security forces have come under attack, and also political assassinations alleged to have been carried out by radical groups that themselves have ties back to Libya or allegedly have sought refuge in Libya at times after carrying out attacks in Tunisia. So this is definitely a concern. And one of the things that we are seeing now is on the part of the conservative party which won Tunisia's most recent elections is a greater emphasis on, or a greater fear being expressed towards Islamist movements in general, right? Both domestic, but also in Libya. And so you might see some change there in relation to Tunisia's position vis-a-vis the Libyan conflict.
That brings up another great question. So we've talked about how Libya has exported instability to the region. But in the current Libyan conflict, we've also seen outside powers involve themselves. Egypt, for instance, has used the threat of violent extremists and weapons and so on crossing from Libya into its territory as a pretext to intervene in the Libyan conflict, supporting the eastern-based government, the forces of Khalifa Hifter, who claim to be waging a military campaign against Islamists, against extremists. And I wonder if the Tunisian government has been involved in the same kind of way in Libya.
This is a very good question. Initially, under the Troika government, there was, for example, you had the controversial extradition of a former Gaddafi prime minister from Tunisia to Libya at a time when there were question marks over Libya's ability to put this person on trial. And what you might see now is an evolution, right? So that would see Tunisia taking on a more sympathetic posture towards those who are engaged in fighting the Libyan Dawn coalition in Libya in itself. But up till now, the main concern in relation to Libya has been trying to insulate Tunisia from the conflict. And unlike you've seen in Egypt, it has been less prone to attempt to engage in that conflict directly. In fact, after the Libyan revolution, a lot of Tunisian involvement in Libya revolved around more technical assistance, right? So Tunisians offering technical expertise in terms of, for example, legal professionals going to Tripoli to provide consultancy and advisory roles to the new Libyan authorities.
Interesting.
And this then brings us to another question, and that's the conflict in Libya and attempting to understand the conflict in Libya. As you mentioned, the Libyan conflict has fallen largely out of international headlines, but it's had massive repercussions across the region in North Africa, from Tunisia to Mali to Egypt to elsewhere. Yet very little is known about the underlying dynamic and causes of that conflict. What we do know is that there are two parliaments vying for authority and seemingly at war with each other in Libya. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that conflict and the nature of that conflict?
Sure, I'll do my best, although it's not easy in a short amount of time, and I can start by saying that I think many Libyans are bewildered also about the exact sources of the conflict. But to put it in simplest terms, we can say that with the collapse of the Gaddafi government, the entire state collapsed. The institutions of the Libyan state that existed under Gaddafi collapsed. And this led to the rise of a lot of insecurity, obviously, but also the rise of very strong regional and tribal identities. Of course, not just identities, but militias affiliated with those identities, affiliated with those towns, cities, and regions. Men who had fought in the revolution, who kept their guns, who stayed in these militias under the pretext of defending their communities, their region, their tribes from outside threats. Over time, these complex and overlapping identities and militias and various political groups have coalesced into two camps. Hence the two parliaments, the two rival parliaments or two rival governments that we have. One of these rival governments is in Tripoli, and it's often described as the Islamist-oriented one, and that's fair enough to say. I would say that there's a lot of ideologically a lot of Islamists there, but there's also a regional component to it. The Misrata being a frontline city during the war with a very strong regional identity, are also part of that. Does it mean that all Misratans are Islamists? Probably not, but for various reasons they've joined that side. Also, in the Western government, we have, for instance, the Amazigh minority group, Berbers, the indigenous people of North Africa. Most of them have also signed on for their own reasons, strategic kind of political reasons, to this Western government, even though they're not necessarily Islamist in the strict sense of the word. In the East, on the other hand, we have a government that fled originally from the West, was elected in internationally recognized elections last summer, the summer of 2014, and they are anti-Islamist in character. It doesn't mean that they're not religious, because most Libyans are religious, but they take a view that there should be more separation between religion and politics. And within that camp, there are people who, not pro-Gaddafi, but maybe people who had worked in some part of Gaddafi's government and then defected early on in the revolution, and they have their own set of militias that have also regional tribal loyalties that have come together under the name of Operation Dignity, and they're led by a former Gaddafi general, but also early defector from Gaddafi back in the 1980s, called Khalifa Hifter. And he has very much adopted this mantra of, we're fighting terrorism, we're fighting extremists, to try to appeal to people like the new president of Egypt, Sisi. He's also received support from the Emirates and others, whereas the government based in the West has received support from Qatar and Turkey, who tend to support more Islamist forces. So there's an external dimension to this too. So I hope that clears things up a little bit.
It actually brings us to my second question, and is that's what role do you see the international community playing in the current conflict? And what role can it play? Yeah,
so I mean, we mentioned one part of the international community, which are regional powers like Turkey and Qatar and Egypt and the Emirates, who've sort of taken sides. Sudan has also played a role in this, supporting the Islamist government. And then we have Europe and the United States, who played obviously a leading role in the 2011 intervention that was led by NATO to stop Gaddafi from slaughtering his own people. They have mostly taken a very much a passive role in this conflict, not wanting to take sides, even as they recognize the legitimacy of the elections that happened last summer. Since then, by the way, I forgot to mention that the Supreme Court of Libya has annulled those elections, saying that they weren't procedurally correct, which puts Europe and the United States in a difficult position. So they have been pushing for a negotiated settlement, but pushing, let's say, lightly, certainly not talking about any kind of follow-up intervention. And then finally we have the United Nations mission to Libya, led by Spanish diplomat Bernardo de Leon, who has recently sponsored peace talks in Geneva attempting to nudge the warring sides toward a political settlement. Unfortunately, those negotiations seem to have failed with one side, the Dawn, Libya Dawn faction, pulling out over recent events, which is an assault by the Operation Dignity forces on the central bank, one of the few working institutions in the country. So things look quite bleak.
And I guess that gets us to the third question, and that's given the negative outcome to the current process, the current negotiations process and conflict resolution process that's been hosted by the UN Special Representative. Yes. How would you assess prospects for peace in Libya in the kind of near and medium term?
Well, in the near term, I think things look very bad, and my Libyan contacts tell me as much. They don't see any solution in the short term. The question is, will there be a point where these various sides just exhaust themselves? Already there seem to be some fissures within both coalitions. Misratans, for instance, have appeared more willing to talk, whereas some of their more Islamist counterparts, militias in that Dawn coalition, have been taking a more hardline stance. But no single militia has sort of the preponderance of force in Libya, has the ability to impose its will. And so we could have this kind of situation where there's quite a bit of violence and quite a bit of chaos and dysfunction, but not necessarily on the level of the Syrian civil war, with the same number of casualties, and yet still a de facto failed state, and sort of a low to mid-level conflict for this foreseeable future, until finally these militias, I guess, are pressured from within to come to the table and come to some sort of settlement. But of course, for ordinary Libyans who are trying to live day to day, that doesn't help their lives much at all.
Thank you very much for that, Meitek.
Thank you. It was fascinating exchange.
It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.